Scrolling social media to see funny cat photos and food photos seems innocent enough. We are learning more about the ways terrorist groups can track online behavior.
6 News' Brent Weber has more on what Homeland Security research is telling us about the malicious use of memes.
Those viral online imitations, memes, can be more than just funny or annoying. They can be terrorizing.
A click, a save, a retweet.
Yeah, a like. That was one of the techniques that we learned about today in the panel, was that even liking them can alert a terrorist network that you're sympathetic to their ideals.
The director of the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center is referring to Thursday's international panel discussing terrorists' use of memes. More than 200 government officials and members of the public joined online.
I first started studying them when ISIS was using them to recruit English speakers. They would do memes with ISIS fighters with kittens, and they would spread like wildfire online because they were so disparate to have a kitten with an ISIS fighter. And now, one of the reasons we held this was after the Buffalo attack this summer. That shooter had a ton of memes in his manifesto.
We're not just concerned about violent memes, we're concerned about how violent memes might impact violence in real life.
Panelist Kat Parsons of Omaha is one of more than 50 Insight researchers from universities across the nation. She shared some of her current studies into how memes can be used to spread violent beliefs.
You know, you're on scrolling Instagram, someone shares a funny meme, you follow an account. And then, suddenly they start sharing amongst those funny memes, things that are kind of racist, right? And so what we can see then is that memes are very much a way to get people in the door.
Ligon cautions that online radicalization strategies using memes are just coming from some faraway country.
It's not just ISIS using memes, it's not just Al-Qaeda, but there are lots of anti-Semitic memes that are floating around out there from some of the domestic groups. We saw a huge spike in those over the last year alone. And just being aware that if your kids or people that you love are experiencing that kind of online content, that they might not even realize that they are clicking on or liking something that was actually generated by a domestic extremist.
On your side in Omaha, Brent Weber, 6 News.
The research continues to evolve with solutions and strategies to follow through the counterterrorism centers like Insight. And for more information, visit our website, WOWT.com.